Oui, merci pour l'introduction.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, and thank you for opening the debate with this introduction. First of all, I would like to address a technical aspect, and I would like to consider, first of all, something which I deem to be fundamental, that is the fact that we obtain Tartaric stability in our context as being a fundamental challenge for the wineries that want to export. And this is fundamental, and it is in the light of this discussion and for our exchanges in the world and within the framework of this forum. Well, you see, you talked about sincerity and authenticity of wine. Well, in order to also link that to Tartaric stability, let's briefly consider a number of essential pieces of information. And I think that in order to do so, we have to start from history, from a background. We have technologies today which are at the disposal of producers which have different objectives. I said that I would have talked about history, and I would like to go back to the period when we had cold treatment of metatartaric acid in Europe. In other countries, in order to tackle this aspect of tartaric stability, we also had cation exchange resins, which is what I would like to talk about. In Europe, we had for a long time an opposition to the usage of these resins due to a number of problems. And at OIV, discussions went on, and they then admitted the usage of these resins for tartaric stability. Another element which I think is very important and which needs to be talked about is the work performed at various enology institutes, including the Bordeaux one, which focused on the usefulness of aging on a lees of whites. And this evidences that manoproteins coming from yeast were interesting for the purpose of stability. And this, indeed, led to the production of manoproteins that were derived from yeasts. The idea was something that evidenced at scientific level the high level of interest of these molecular approaches. Within the framework of that process and in that period, the need for more reliable instruments and tools came into the picture. And again, we are talking about tartaric stability. Our group, therefore, started considering the needs of these companies, and we sought to understand how we could obtain tartaric stability. At that time, we had already expert opinions about exogenous products. There was an attitude whereby, especially the Reims University in the Champagne, said that these products should be banned. So you see, there was a debate. This is what I mean. And at the time, we considered electrolysis dialysis being used. You certainly know it, and we will go back to it, and we will also try and see what advantages derive from this technology. Another important event is the interest on the part of the winemaking world at international level for environmental aspects, specifically in Champagne, in France, and in other countries as well. People reflected in general about this aspect. And due to this high environmental interest and concern, they assessed Tartaric stability being obtained through cooling techniques. Different solutions were studied and examined, and carboxymethyl cellulose was one of the proposals made. It is available today. So in order to conclude this sort of historic background account, I can say that at OIV, we further investigated the matter, and certainly at the next Congress in Sofia, we will go back to that, and polyaspartate, in this case, is the focus of attention. So this is the situation. Our debate rotates around these questions and issues related to the technologies I mentioned. You certainly all understood that each one of these technologies has a number of advantages and benefits, and this is related to what we can obtain in the future, and also to the respect for genuine products. The things at stake here are very many in number, and they are also different. So this is what we are going to talk about, and definitely we will have the opportunity to exchange fruitful experience and know-how based on everybody's contributions. If I may, I would also like to add one last remark. In order to tackle this issue, it is important for the entire sector to have methods which make it possible to really characterize stability or instability, and what we mean by that. I would like to insist on the concept of the extent of this stability or instability. You might say, pick one treatment, you use it, and then necessarily you have a stable or unstable wine. This might also derive from the level of stability or instability of the wine itself. So there is this concept of level of stability. The instruments that are used to characterize it, to describe it, and to make sure at producers that they use reliable treatments in relation to what they want to obtain, you have, again, to use these instruments. And I hope that I answered your question. And of course, I'm ready to go back to the various points.
Now, this being said, among the various techniques that are available, you mentioned electrodialysis. I'd like to ask Mr. Scrinzi the following question. Since you deal with many different types of wines from north to south, where did you find out that electrodialysis could give its best, that it was most applicable? And more specifically, what benefits did you discover from using this technique? Well, yes, good morning to all. My initial approach to electrodialysis was back in 2009 when we entrusted the management of the Bolla winery when we took over, and I have to be honest, we were skeptical at the beginning about using this technology. The experts and winemakers there were pretty good. I mean, they had introduced the equipment back in 2002, and it was introduced by Professor Novello, and it was the second machine of the kind introduced in Italy. Professor Novello had carried out a very advanced study which was very detailed from a scientific point of view in terms of analytical readings and tasting notes and everything, and sensory characteristics. The company, the manufacturer, was part of an American conglomerate, Danforth, and they had a certain mastery of these processes. So the machine had been sold back in 2002. I was very perplexed about using the machine, and perhaps in the next hour we'll come back to this. Concerned primarily the red wines. I had started to work on red wines in a pretty intensive manner. Then once I learned how to use the machine and how to calibrate it and adjust it, I could really benefit from its full potential, which was much more than the other stabilization methods, including cold stabilization, because it preserved the colloidal elements and the color. In 2010, based on our experience with the various techniques that had been developed in the course of time, I had a chance to work with a South African stagiaire, Anna Kenning, who, in cooperation with the French University and ESA and the University of Bologna, helped us refocus all Tartaric stabilization systems, including electrodialysis, cold stabilization, which was in use in our other wineries, also taking care of nanoproteins, CMCs and resins and everything. So we really were able to compare like for like. There too, we produced a big body of studies which, combined with Professor Novello's, confirmed that electrodialysis was ideal for Tartaric stabilization. In 2014, unfortunately, and that is something that happens in wineries, in a very small winery, which was part of our group, there was a problem that cropped up on a relatively small production of Moscato with calcium precipitation. And unfortunately, for a number of reasons associated with our importers and something else, that created a major problem. We could not, with cold stabilization, settle the problem in a safe way, and so that prompted us to implement a machine on the same equipment on a much smaller winery that produces approximately 1 million bottles. So we started seeing whether that was applicable elsewhere, and we realized that there were many applications in our southern Italian wineries, where there were problems with cold stabilization techniques. Hence, we introduced the same technology to Sicily. And after that, we took a major step forward in 2015 at Lamberti, 35 million bottles. They make Prosecco. They produce, of that particular wine, they produce 10 million bottles. So they had a problem with the footprint that they could devote to stabilization. So we pondered once again what we could do in terms of equipment. We took a 120 that we could expand to 240 in order to fix the problems that we were encountering. But, you know, we adopted it for completely different reasons depending on the winery. Now, electrodialysis in our wineries is used regardless of whether the wine attend is white, red, or rosé. And we're now assessing whether it could be used for For Turat, we have wineries where we have very small numbers that could benefit from that treatment, like 10,000 bottles, and particularly wines that are aged in oak. I mean, when the bottles are stabilized before bottling in oak and manoproteins can be beneficial, we use the manoproteins a lot. So mostly electrodialysis has replaced for cold stabilization and also massively CMC, not because CMC doesn't work, but because in some cases we encountered some minor instability problems.
Diceva perché trovo molto interessante.
I'd like to go back to what you're saying because there might be some commercial outcomes from your choice to use electrodialysis in terms of exports and also retail distribution. What are the how is it received by these customers? Well, as we said yesterday, in today's markets, our wines must be perfect in terms of product stability, first and foremost. Then you have other parameters that you have to comply with, and you have to stay in line with the specs that the buyers and the customers prescribed. Hardly ever do buyers get involved in our technical choices, although increasingly often we have buyers who come from the various retail chains that are asking questions, but no one has ever imposed us to treat a wine using electrodialysis or any other means for that matter. However, it is true that someone has asked us in the course of time to avoid cold stabilization and move on to CMC. That was a big choice. I mean, now for sure, it has to do with safety. I have to be honest with you. Minor instability problems, well, we know we've encountered them. And I'll give you this example because it was something I dealt with. As I mentioned before, Cabianca had a problem with 6,000 to 7,000 bottles of Moscato that started re-fermenting. In Korea, where Moscato is the flagship wine and where our importer is the largest beer producer in the country, who was selling our wine to the most important retail chain in the country. So for those 6,000 to 7,000 bottles for which we had a problem, we jeopardized the relationship with that importer and the entire market in Korea. And not only that, we were also jeopardizing our importers' relations to the largest retail distribution chain. So I had to buy a ticket to go to Korea, and I hired a Korean man who had graduated in Geisenheim and had to address stability for one whole day. I think we've clarified well enough how important it is to guarantee stability and what the role of stabilization can be. Mr. Udo Gruber, on top of this guarantee of stability, what are the other advantages? What are the other benefits of electrodialysis? What are the benefits? Are the benefits of electrodialysis?
Good morning. Yeah, we are traditionally a producer of sparkling wine, and traditionally we use cold stabilization for our sparkling wine. When we decided to introduce wine-based mixed drinks, we discussed the possibilities to do the stabilization. And because of a lack of place for cooling tanks And because we don't want any additives like CMC or these things in the products, we decided for electrodialysis. Some years ago, we did some tests with a rented machine with the electrodialysis, and we were very satisfied with the results. But for some other reasons, we couldn't implement this in our sparkling wine production. But these positive tests forced us to invest in this modern technology.
Do you also find any benefits from a sensory perspective in the wines that are treated like that? So, in other words, from a sensory profile, are there any benefits compared to the cold stabilization technique? And that's a question for Professor Mutsune as well. Does electrodialysis offer any extra benefits compared to cold stabilization in preserving the characteristics of the wine, the aroma, the body, the color, the texture, the taste?
For us, I cannot say that we have found any positive things with the new techniques, but on the other side, there are no negative things. What is for us also a positive thing, that you can better divide the different tanks of wines and different types of wines. With cold stabilization, you often have the problem with contact crystals to the stabilization, that there may be a blend between the tanks. But this was one of the positive things we, which brought us to the decision.
Grazie. Professore.
Oui, sur la question.
Now, to answer your question, when it comes to how the technology affects the characteristics of the product, all the people who took part in the evolution to solve the problem of Tartaric stability, all the scholars who've worked on that, and all the tests that have been carried out by the group of experts set up by the OIV, would say that there would be some differences in the final result. Those who criticize the cold stabilization techniques from a qualitative standpoint did not really attack the cooling process per se, but they would attack other techniques that would come with that particular cooling technique. We know that the success of this cold processing technique, in order to do that, you need to prepare the wines for cooling. The wine undergoes fining and clarification and filtrations, one after the other. And once the crystals have formed by refrigeration, so using low temperatures, it is necessary to filter the wine again to screen these crystals. And it is these operations associated with cold stabilization that might affect the wine more than the other techniques. Well, the other techniques, when it comes to adding an inhibitor, because the strategy we are pursuing for stabilization requires very often to induce crystallization using low temperatures, or if you try to screen the ions away or take out the ions to avoid oversaturation, or you can add inhibitors for crystal formation, and this is exactly what we're talking about, the formation of crystals. Now, it is pretty clear that the products that may be added are well defined, well known, and so if they are foreign to the wine, they will contribute to the authenticity and genuineness of the wine that you mentioned, that you referred to in your introduction. We do not have these characteristics here. Now, compared to when you use the manoproteins, which are naturally present in the wine. In this case, to ensure stability, there are very specific quantities in order to obtain this effect of limiting the creation of crystals, and this technique will aim at inhibiting the formation of such crystals. Thank you very much, Professor. Can we say that manoproteins have been mentioned? Now, can Mr. Brigigna tell us more about his use of manoproteins and the benefits that he has encountered in using this technique? Well, thank you to you all. I'd like to mention that this is more of a practical approach. Mine is more of a practical approach and not so much a theoretical or scientific experience that I have. My experience with manoproteins dates back to a few years ago when the product was first marketed. The trade name back then was Claristar. And we assessed it for two reasons primarily: a technical approach and one from the point of view of the producers themselves, so a practical and financial approach.
As the professor said, refrigeration implies a series of operations, which is additional filtering, the preparation of wine, and especially a number of risks that derive from the lowering of temperature and the absorption of the risk of absorption of oxygen should any operation not work out as it should, and you expose wine to oxygen, hence absorption, hence the risk for oxidation, which means that it is a very critical and dangerous phase. It is risky, it's not dangerous, but it is possibly risky. So my approach, I would say, was immediately positive because this new thing avoided that risk. In addition to that, you see, with refrigeration, there is a precipitation of crystals and part of the acidity is subtracted, taken away. And refrigeration is a system which makes it possible to adjust the pH at that moment. It is a totally different approach. And then you also have the economic aspect to consider. You see, producers always look at the economic cost. Since it is a manoprotein and comes from yeast, and this requires a complex process, it is not chemical extraction as could be with aerobic rubber and so on and so forth. It is expensive, but I would say that the approach for entry level towards entry products could suffer from the fact that it is difficult to justify anyway the higher price. But if you consider what you lose in terms of production due to refrigeration, because we know that a certain percentage is discarded due to that, and since you have the extra filtering vis-a-vis the other treatments, and since you also consider men work and the cost of refrigeration, well, perhaps your assessment might change. And you must also know that in many cases you can also avoid the insulated tanks, which we know are higher in terms of economic cost when compared to a non-isolated insulated tank. Hence our positive approach on both sides. And then there was a further surprise from the viewpoint of the organoleptic quality, in that vis-à-vis refrigeration and with the addition of monoproteins in wine, and with reference to different products. And here I would like to anticipate that I have some experience with white still wines from traditional farming, because in the organic sector you cannot use monoproteins yet. And we could also talk about that actually, because other substances are permitted, and I would say that, well, that is perhaps even more questionable, and the representative of OIV is here, so certainly we will hear more about that. But anyway, it is not possible in organic wines. We also saw a change in that monoproteins not only influence tartaric stability, but also the quality of the wine. And when I talk about quality, I talk about balance, I talk about concentration, I talk about finish, I talk about important parameters for the quality of the product. Let me make an example. Because obviously, if we think of monoproteins and amino acids with their sweetening properties, which is 100 times higher than in sucrose, in some cases, then obviously you perceive, after the addition, a higher sweetness. So when you work at the balance of on the balance of the wine, you have to consider that. Again, going back to sugar, if you add a few grams of sucrose or something else in the wine, when monoproteins are added, that addition is less strong in a way. I don't have any scientific evidence to offer you on this. This is something which is based on my experience. When monoproteins were added, also the sugar residue was less, and you have an increase in acidity. And this is something that we did not find with CMC. But then with CMC, things changed again, because, of course, if you do something that has an impact at economic level, that is a major event. And with CMC, you have another issue, because with CMC, you do not have protein stability. I would say that CMC is even more selective. It is more aggressive towards proteins. So with carboxymethylcellulose, you have to add or increase bentonite, and you also know that this has an effect on the structure of wine and impoverishes wine. So this is my technical views. Thank you. That is very, very clear. I have a last question for you, Professor. We talked about CMC, and I would like also to know a bit more about the legislative aspects. This CMC technique that, if I understood correctly, vis-a-vis monoprotein is a chemical, artificial thing, exogenous, of course, what about legislative aspects? It is forbidden in some countries. I know that it is permitted in our countries, but perhaps in the future that could be constraints in relation to the usage of CMC. So, vis-a-vis carboxymethylcellulose, CMC, there are countries where the usage of these substances is forbidden. Do you think that in the future, in terms of laws and provisions and rules in 10 years, say, we will also have these limitations which forbid using CMC? Well, without any prospective study, it is very difficult to know what the situation will be in the future and what is going to be the evolution of the context. It is true that it is a very important issue because tartaric stability pertains, I would say, to almost all wines. Out of 145 million hectoliters of wine, I would say that all of them are unstable when produced. So this is really an important topic. And different positions are created, as you mentioned. There are countries which, due to their situation of the market and their situation, they avoid using this way certain trade, imports and exports. On the other hand, we have OIV, which wants to favor international exchange, and this is one of the important missions of OIV. The mission of OIV is not only that of authorizing new products as soon as research proposes new solutions. It is a reality that does exist, and this has to taken into consideration by the producers when they decide their strategies, and especially when they decide to have certain equipment to be and to be successful on international markets. And of course, you have to be sure about what you propose. You see, we export to Japan, for instance, and a number of products that can be used for tartaric stability purposes are used not only to guarantee quality for our European exports to Japan. It is also important that there are some legislative constraints and limitations. The trend, though, is to have more opening rather than limitations. Because you see, a number of international positions and stances will no longer be sustainable. And I'm talking about co-responsibility here. That is, it is important to save energy and consider also production waste with more attention, because this means an ethical approach to wine production. And of course, this has repercussions. They will have repercussions on the image of the product and the image of producers. The consumer countries which do not produce wine have different interests, of course. Today, the adopted criterion by exporters is the criterion of reliability and Tartaric stability. Electrodialysis is doing very well in terms of that criterion, because thanks to the control system, each and every batch is treated in relation to its stability or instability. So there is no overtreatment when compared to other techniques, which means that we have reached optimum stability. The other stabilization methods, the other technical approaches that serve the purpose of giving stability can possibly offer different and other benefits, for instance, in relation to being environmental friendly, which means that you have to make your choices while taking into account the future. You have to have foresighted strategies, which in turn entail knowing very well crystallization processes and know how they work, so that you can decide what to do for the future. And we also need to consider the evolution of the mine market, our positioning, and the markets we address. So, you see, a producer will not have to be necessarily monolithic in adopting just one technology. It will have to adjust its decisions in relation to the countries it addresses its production to. We now have a number of instruments and tools at our disposal that we can use, and we do also expect that here the audience will ask questions about that to go more into detail. Evolutions have taken place in the technological field, and of course technology is developed when an existing technology has some defects. At at each new phase, the previous technique was criticized, and this was useful in order to make progress. I think, for example, of refrigeration, which entailed saving energy massively. So it is legitimate to expect progress. I really will welcome the audience's questions, because I hope to receive inputs from them. They will be able to identify what we have to pay attention to. But we do have techniques that we know very well today with their pros and cons, and this helps us making the right decisions and reflecting upon things. Of course, we have also to think of the future market of wine, but I'm not an economist and I can't say anything about that. Well, thank you very much. Before opening the floor to questions, I would like to translate with images and into images what you said. I imagine the technique of electrodialysis as a Mercedes. Meaning that it is a reliable car, absolutely reliable. And this also mirrors the image we have of Germany, something reliable, where you know the time frame, you know the cost, and you know you will meet your objective in an efficient way and reliable way without any squandering of time and costs. It is a luxury car, but actually you can basically afford it. Also because you can rent a car, and it is a very precise thing. Since it has this sort of surgical approach in guaranteeing Tartaric stability, it also preserves the organoleptic properties of reds and whites. And this is my picture of electrodialysis. Then, When I think of nanoproteins, and especially Claristar, I think of a motorbike. This is a Ducati, an entirely different world which goes for flexibility, being in nature, driving easy, so to say, riding easy. You are in the environment, you see nature, you are in nature, you feel the wind, you feel it also, when coming to wine, everything which has to do with the nature of wine,